What's the worst species in the galaxy? Sentient species, I mean, that you've had to deal with. There's a lot of spacers in here today, and we've all met our fair share of aliens. Hey, there are half a dozen different species in this cafeteria right now, and a few more on this trading post. So in all the galaxy, which sentient species do you want to avoid above all others? Humans? That's the usual answer. They're dangerous, all right. Certainly wouldn't want to get into a fight with one of them. Ka-lu-kum-sku. Pain in the hindquarters to communicate with, and if you do get through to them, their answer is likely to be, "We're doing this whether you like it or not. Get out of our way." Then there are the Grisk, the Upau-Rukvau, and the Ashoa, the extremophile species. It's hard to find common ground with people who breathe methane or require an ambient temperature above the boiling point of water. Well, as a starship captain, I've seen a lot, but it's a big galaxy out there. So take this with a grain of salt, but based on my personal experience and what I've heard in several decades working the deep space routes, I'd say the absolute worst species in the galaxy, the ones you really don't want to come across, are the Staton. You weren't expecting that, were you? The Staton aren't known for being particularly dangerous. They have the same environmental requirements as the majority of sentient species, and they negotiate and trade with the rest of the galaxy without too much trouble. In the grand scheme of things, they fit in fairly well to the pan-galactic community of star-faring species. Well, all that's true, but let me tell you there's no one, anywhere in the known universe, who is so relentlessly untrustworthy. Less common sense than a fledgling, too. But it's the total lack of scruples that gets you. Yeah, laugh all you want. I know they're not very intimidating, certainly not compared to humans, or even most other sentient species in the galaxy. 1.5 meters tall at most, no natural weaponry or armor, just insulating fur and a pair of short tusks they usually file down anyway. They spend most of their time hanging upside down by their tails. Not aggressive either, not the type to start a fight. But that doesn't mean they can't get you killed. I have a nestkin who served on a freighter who told me this story, that he got from a cook on a scout ship, who got it from a trading post on Tamiya. And for years, I didn't believe it, until I met someone from the crew it happened to. In a cafeteria not too different from the one we're in now, on the trading post orbiting Eos. You know how it is. You get a couple of deep spacers together, and sooner or later someone asks, "What's the craziest thing you've seen out there?" Well, someone asked, and this guy starts going on and on about this one time his ship answered a distress call from some Staton. An Amia ship, by the way. This guy was as Amia as I am, and I still didn't believe him. Thought he'd been letting his fruit punch ferment a little too long, if you know what I mean. I'd already heard the story so many times I thought it was just an urban legend he was trying to pass off as his own. But when I told him as much, he didn't get offended. He gave me a look that said, "Yeah, no one ever believes me." I almost left, but something about that look, so I told him, "Prove it, if you can." Well, he took me back to his ship and he showed me the logs. That shut me up right enough. It had all of it, vid footage, log entries, even the IDs of the crewmen involved, although for privacy's sake, I'll name no names. So I swear on my mother's beak, what I'm about to tell you is a true story. It started with a distress call. They were a transport ship, the Light Feather. It's a common enough name, no harm in telling you that. On a mission to bring a couple of million tons of seed stock and dried fruit to the research cities on Miayimpa 4. 3 months into a 4-month journey, and they were well beyond the high-traffic shipping routes, and it had been more than a week since they'd even picked up another ship on long-range scans. Then something came in over the comms. A call for help. Well, not even that. Just a code from the UCS book. Universal Communication Standards for you non-spacers listening. Signaling a ship in distress and in need of assistance, plus their coordinates. Regulations said they had to render aid to any ship in trouble if possible. So the Light Feather changed course to investigate. The captain was an old spacer. He'd spent years at a time in the deep black, so he'd never have left a ship stranded even without regulations. But when they got into sensor range and they saw who had sent the distress call, he almost turned the ship around. Because he was an old spacer, he knew trouble when he saw it. The signal had come from a Staton city ship. The Staton are more social than most species, among their own kind, that is. And they don't like to leave their home world without a large number of other Staton around them. And I mean a large number. Their smallest ships hold several thousand, and the city ships run up to several million. This one was on the smaller side, a little under 5 kilometers long, probably a long-range exploration vessel, so its crew was only around 100,000. The crew of the Light Feather numbered a whole 23. All of them Amia, mind. So worth 2 or 3 of any other species. Joke, joke. No need to get your feathers ruffled or whatever it is your species ruffles. But still, not much help to a ship of that size. And they didn't know what the Statstorm thought they were going to be able to do for them. The Statston hailed them as soon as they were within range. It was clear that they were desperate. Large sections of their ship had lost life support, and they'd retreated into their central nest chambers. The life support systems in those areas were struggling to keep the air scrubbed and the temperature down. They still had FTL, but this far out they wouldn't reach a habitable world in time. It wouldn't be long before they had nowhere left to go. They wanted to abandon ship. All 100,000 of them. They'd given up trying to fix their systems, so they'd decided their only option was to hitch a ride with someone else. The Light Feather was a large freighter, 1.5 kilometers long. So technically, it had the space to take them, if it dumped its cargo. But it would have been cramped as hell, and jury-rigging life support to accommodate an extra 100,000 life forms wasn't likely to end any better than leaving the Statston where they were. So the captain decided he had to turn them down, but because regulations and his conscience said he had to give them any help he could, he offered to send his engineers over to take a look at their systems, see if there were any repairs they could make or any spare parts on the Light Feather that might be useful. The thing about the Statston is they don't have a conscience. I mean that in the most literal sense. They're biologically amoral. It isn't normally an issue because normally outsiders deal with them only in a limited set of circumstances for which there are prearranged rules. The Statston understand rules. They like rules, and they'll follow them to the letter. If you want to trade with them, or negotiate with them, or just pay them a visit, then so long as you agree a framework for your meeting beforehand, you should be fine. But if there was no rule against it, and the Statston thought they might gain some advantage by it, then they would happily kill you and not spare it a second thought. They're not an aggressive species, mind. Far from it. Their instinctive response to stress is to climb up somewhere high and curl into a ball, so there's little danger of them attacking you. But you'd want to think very carefully before going aboard their ship and putting yourself in their hands. Of course, both the Amia and the Statston are ancient spacefaring species, and a protocol for answering distress signals had been negotiated long ago. The captain of the Light Feather took a moment to familiarize himself with the procedures, but it seemed like it covered everything he could think of. Even so, before he left the ship, he gave clear instructions to the crew who were staying. If they lost contact with the rescue party, they weren't to send more people over to find out what happened. They were to send out their own distress call right away. 12 Amia went over to the stricken city ship. The captain, the safety officer, the medic, plus the 9 engineers to see what they could do for the life support systems. The first mate and cargo specialists stayed behind along with 3 of the engineers. If anything did happen, the captain wanted to make sure the Light Feather could get home again. Statston ships aren't complicated. 2-kilometer diameter habitation sphere at the front, connected by a thin spine to the main reactor and the engines at the back. The captain decided to dock the shuttle at an airlock halfway along the spine. The city ship's shuttle bay was functional, but rather than make space on their ships for hangars, the Statston dismantle their shuttles after use and store the components separately. They're a technologically sophisticated species, and their auto-factories can assemble and disassemble small craft almost as quickly as they could move a shuttle from hangar to launch bay, provided the components are available. It's efficient, and it means they can customize shuttles for the specific circumstances. The captain didn't know how familiar they were with Amiya tech, and he didn't want to take the chance that they wouldn't be able to put his shuttle back together. That, and he wanted to know there was a shuttle there waiting for him the moment he decided to leave. A delegation of Staton met them at the airlock, about 50 of them, because in a group any smaller than that they'd start having panic attacks. Have you ever seen a Staton in person? You'd never see them in a place like this. They like to stay with their own kind. Don't often see them fraternizing with other species. I've met a couple over the years. They're shorter than Amiya, and they only have 3 limbs compared to our 12. Yes, 12, not 6. Aliens describe us as having 1 pair of arms, wings, and legs each, but our secondary wings count as separate limbs. The Staton are tripodal, so on the ground they amble along using their 2 long forelimbs and a pad at the base of their tail. But they're an arboreal species, so they're more comfortable climbing, where they can use their long, prehensile tail. 4 eyes, 2 forward-facing, and 2 on each side of their head. All in all, not too unusual by the standards of the whole galaxy. Their diet on their home world is exclusively nutrient-rich sap from the trees they live in. Triangular mouth, with 2 tusks to strip away bark. Most Staton who live in space file these down for convenience. They have a really long tongue for rooting for sap, which limits the sounds they can make, but their language is still mostly vocalizations with a few gestures. Not intimidating, not even particularly alien-looking, in a galaxy that includes species like the WRickWritesSciFi. All in all, you'd be forgiven for thinking they couldn't be a danger even if they wanted to be. But don't trust them. It'll come back to bite you, and with sharp teeth. Life support in the spine was out too, so everyone was wearing spacesuits. Amiya suits are red for visibility, while the Staton were in mottled green and brown, same colors as their fur, since the captain had dealt with the Staton before he was expecting them to be in a large group. What he wasn't expecting was that they'd all be armed. Well, armed? They were holding arc welders, laser cutters, industrial solder machines, and gas sprayers. But that was just engineering equipment, right? All perfectly normal tools for a maintenance team expecting to do some heavy-duty repairs. But the way they were holding them. The captain decided he was just being paranoid. Whatever else they might be, the Staton weren't violent. Whatever had happened to their ship, it had screwed up their systems so thoroughly they didn't even have lighting. Which, by the way, was the first topic of discussion. What exactly had happened to their ship? After all, it was 5 kilometers long. It should take a hell of a lot of punishment to knock out life support like this. But there was not sign of external damage. Unexpected malfunction of the environmental controls was all they would say. The engine section, the spine, and the outer layers of the primary hull had all been rendered uninhabitable. Only the inner core of the sphere, the large chambers where the Staton put their nests and nurseries, were still occupied. But with over 100,000 individuals crammed in there, the oxygen was dropping fast and the heat was rising. The captain pressed for details, of course, but they just kept saying unexpected malfunction of the environmental controls. The 4th time, they repeated the exact same words. The captain checked his translation software to see if it was glitching. But no. They just wouldn't give any more information. He tried to press them, but no one was talking, and trying to work out who was in charge was pointless. The Staton don't have leaders. They do their decision-making by mutual agreement. I heard a theory from a xenopsychologist once that this is the reason they often seem to have no common sense. They evolved to live in much smaller groups, but their social instinct is so strong that when they developed the technology to support larger populations, it drove them to build larger and larger communities, well past what they were psychologically prepared to deal with. In their native habitat, Every so often, a Staton would have to make an individual decision. But when you've got 100,000 others around you, decision-making is always someone else's problem. The Staton seemed to have decided to take the rescue team to the nearest control node for the life support systems, which was in the habitat sphere. Fortunately, there was enough power in the spine that they could run the transport pods. The reactors were still online, and primary systems were functioning. It was only the life support that was out. Which was weird because normally life support is designed to be the last thing to fail. The transport pod took them to the right level, but then there was about 200 meters of corridor to the node, 200 meters with no cover in the dark. If you're not Amia, you won't understand this, but we hate spending long periods in spacesuits. Can't use our wings. It's like a straitjacket. You learn to deal with it, of course, if you're in the deep space industry, but not being able to fly for cover, well, the rescue team was already nervous, and that didn't make it any better. And what made the captain even more nervous was that the Staton escorting them seemed to be nervous too. The group kept shifting around them as the individuals on the edge tried to get on the inside, and the ones then left exposed tried to shuffle back towards the middle, all the while holding their tools like they were expecting to do some surprise repairs any moment. Being tripods, it's not easy for them to walk and hold stuff at the same time, but the Staton were not letting go of their equipment. The captain checked a couple of the vents used for atmosphere regulation along the way. They weren't working, obviously, but there was no sign why, like ash from an out-of-control fire. Then they came across a robot, looming in the darkness, wide enough that it almost filled the corridor, and the corridor was big enough to accommodate large groups of Staton passing through. It was obviously junk now, bits and pieces of it all over the place. The captain asked about it, but all the escorts would say was that it was a repair drone that had malfunctioned. They got to the life support node without any trouble, though, which was a relief. You know what the Staton said then? They said, look at the node and see repairs to life support are not possible. Evacuation is necessary. They hadn't ever intended to fix anything, just prove to the crew of the Light Feather that their ship was beyond repair and they needed a ride. The captain, of course, wasn't having any of that. He told his engineers to do everything they could think of to bring the damaged node back online. Meanwhile, they waited. In the dark, airless corridor. And while they were waiting for the Light Feather's engineers to assess the damage, the captain noticed that one of the Staton was holding a scanner. Well, he'd noticed it already. But he'd thought it was just to plot the safest route to the node, avoiding any sections with high radiation or busted plasma conduits or something dangerous like that. So why was he still holding it? And why was he still paying extremely close attention to it? The corridor must not have been in total vacuum, because the captain's suit picked up the sound from the scanner. Faint, but unmistakable. Definitely some kind of alert. The change in the Staton was immediate. They started to bunch together even tighter, crowding round the node so that the engineers working there had to start physically shoving them away. More than a couple of the Staton were trying to climb up onto the ceiling, but although there were handholds there, as there are on every surface on a Staton ship, it didn't accomplish much. The corridor wasn't very high, so when they hung down by their tails, their faces were level with head height for an Amia, and we're not exactly tall ourselves, around 1.70 meters usually. The captain could pick up their radio emissions, but they were on a scrambled channel, so he couldn't tell what they were saying to each other. They were definitely talking about something, though. He asked, but all they said was, "Hazard detected." Another dozen escorts climbed onto the ceiling. The captain was about to tell the engineers to pack up their gear because it was definitely time to get the hell out of there. But before he could give the order, one of the engineers reported back. The damage was deliberate, not the result of an overload or a malfunctioning control system. The only way it could have been done was if someone was trying to take out life support. It was sabotage.